Howdy, folks. Jason Gates here, coming to you from sunny Albuquerque, New Mexico. I'm a senior member of the technical staff over here at Sandia National Laboratories. I started programming way back in middle school, and over the years, my focus has shifted from physics to math to automation and so on. But these days, I mostly help a handful of scientific teams improve their software engineering practices in a whole variety of ways. My passion is to help you do the amazing work you already do, but do it better, more efficiently, more joyfully. And that's the motivation for our talk today. This talk is for all the book nerds out there. Brownie points if you recognize all 14 literary references. I'm assuming, since you're here at GitKon, that you're already using Git for version control. If that's the case, then my message to all of you is that you're all storytellers in a way that perhaps you hadn't realized yet. What do I mean by that? Humans use language to communicate with one another. Clearly, I'm using English to communicate with you now, but if we were off at a software engineering event in Germany, dann würden wir Deutsch miteinander sprechen. Regardless of the language used, you also need a communication medium. And when it comes to the written word, various media have been used over time. In some cases, it was clay tablets, and others, rolls of vellum. I grew up in Egypt in the 90s, which kids these days might call ancient Egypt, so I'm familiar with papyrus, but eventually we got around to books, and then film, and then the internet, and then pre-recorded videos at virtual conferences. Part of being human is we're storytellers by nature, so we use these various media to tell our stories. Sometimes it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Others, it's in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. And still others, it's once upon a time, a band of intrepid researchers did the science and produced the pretty plots and lived to publish another day. Hopefully. Why am I saying all of this? Because software, too, is a communication medium. From you to your team, from you to your future self. And we use it to tell the story of how a particular cast of characters in a certain setting set out on a journey to solve their problems together. You see, code is read much more often than it's written, and then understanding the code means developing a mental model to make sense of it. My contention to you is that the repository history lends structure to that mental model. Without the history, looking at the code and trying to make sense of it is kind of like being plopped down in a boat next to Odysseus on his way home from Troy, but without any of the backstory. You can learn a little about him and his companions, but you're missing all the details of their lives up until this point. Why they fought in the Trojan War, and their motivations and frustrations as they're trying to make it back to Ithaca, and so on. Let me translate this back to software. How many of you have been reading a piece of code and wind up thinking, what on earth? This doesn't make any sense. Why would they do such a thing? I'm just going to change it. To this, G.K. Chesterton would reply, if you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. And then when you can come back and tell me that you do see the use of it, I may allow you to destroy it. Without a repository history that tells a coherent narrative, it'll be difficult to make well-informed decisions when you start interacting with the code. So how do you actually do the thing, though? How do you use Git to tell a good story? Well, to go into all the details, we'd be here all day, but let me at least give you a high-level view of what it takes. Unless you're C.S. Lewis, penning The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which was apparently written in a white heat of inspiration and required minimal editing, sitting down to write a story usually starts with pre-writing. This is where you sketch out the major plot points and the overall story arc. In terms of software development, this means planning out your work before actually doing it. I know. In the software world, our work is often exploratory. We just don't know where we're going until we get there. I'll come back to that, but I guarantee you, regardless of your context, that this is a skill you can further develop. Open an issue and just start jotting down what you think will be needed. And then dive into the code and start poking around, but don't touch anything yet. At this stage, you're just getting a feel for the work that'll likely be required and taking notes in the issue as you go. If your team values it, start assigning time or complexity estimates to the different subtasks. And then when you think you have things mapped out reasonably well, invite your colleagues to chime in. This is like Rick Castle workshopping his book ideas with Cannell, Conley, and Patterson over a game of poker. Your story will improve with the feedback of your fellow authors. But nothing ever goes according to plan. Are you kidding me? I know. But Winston Churchill would remind you that plans are of little importance, but planning is essential. Once you dive into doing the work, good storytelling involves good Git hygiene. Really? We're going to talk about showering and brushing our teeth now? Well, in a manner of speaking, yes. Here are some practices I want you to keep in mind while doing your development. The first is to make atomic commits. What on earth are those? It's like taking the single responsibility principle of object-oriented design and applying it to the commits you make. This means any given commit should do only one thing and do it well. It should probably be small enough such that the diff is easy to reason through at a glance. There are definitely exceptions here, but keep in mind, if you give a person a 10-line diff, he'll find 10 problems. If you give him a 1,000-line diff, he'll say, looks good to me. For your own protection, your atomic commits should also probably include a comprehensive and passing test suite. This kind of attention to detail makes finding and addressing bugs substantially easier. And problems will pop up. There's no getting away from that. But the shorter the fire drill, the better it is for everyone's sanity. Next, you'll want to adopt the conventional commit specification. This is a way to add semantic meaning to your commits by classifying them according to their type. For instance, build, chore, CI, docs, features, etc. Is anyone out there a Brandon Sanderson fan? One of my favorite aspects of his Stormlight Archive books is each chapter is told from the perspective of one of the main characters. And at the beginning of each chapter is a little symbol indicating which character is the focus. When you read the history of a repository using conventional commits, it's kind of like reading a Stormlight novel in that the commit type gives you an idea of what this next part in the story is going to be about before you even get into it. If a developer is confused about a line of code and their IDE gives them a little tooltip with the latest commit that touched it, you have a really quick indication of how this change fits into the broader narrative. Oh, I see. It's part of that feature edition, for instance. You'll also want to take the time to craft high-quality commit messages. Oftentimes when people talk about good commit messages, they're thinking in terms of style, things like capitalization, line wrapping, maybe usage of markdown syntax or imperative voice, and so on. The only thing I'll say here is your team should pick a standard and automatically enforce it, so no one has to worry about it ever again. The stylistic details are important. Without consistency, it's like reading a book with a bunch of different authors, which is a jarring experience. But more importantly, you want to use your commit messages to explain the change. Give me the who, what, when, where, why, and how. We'll revisit this from another perspective in just a moment, but before we leave commit messages, let me also encourage you to make them easy to search. Instead of, I fixed a bug in some component, include relevant details from the code. Names of files, classes, functions, variables, etc., along with any error messages you ran into. And then when future you runs into a problem, you'll be able to find how you solved it last time much more easily. Finally, in both the code you write and the commit messages you author, you want to focus on educating future readers. This is admittedly hard to do for authors across the board, not just in software. I was reading a book this past year written by R.L. Dabney back in 1882. He was writing about detrimental changes that had been taking place in the American culture in the decades prior, and he frequently made comments along the lines of, you know the way things used to be. And here I was 140 years later saying, no, I don't, because you didn't give me any details. It's far too easy to only think of the audience that's immediately in front of you. Yourself, or perhaps your team, at least as it's comprised at the moment. But if you can write for someone reading the history in the future with a different background, different experiences, in a different setting, that's really one of the best gifts you can give your future collaborators. Now, I'd be lying if I told you this sort of focus on Git hygiene comes naturally. Benjamin Disraeli, British Prime Minister, poet, and novelist, once said, "Cleanliness and order are not matters of instinct, they're matters of education. And like most great things, you must cultivate a taste for them." I submit to you that it'll be worthwhile for you individually and for all of us within this software engineering culture to develop such tastes. Now, let's move away from individual commits for a bit and head back through time to your language arts class in grade school. Do you remember what you learned about story arcs? You start off with some initial exposition where you lay out the setting and the cast of characters. Then there's an inciting incident which triggers the rising action until you finally reach the climax. And then after that, there's the falling action down to the denouement. Okay. What on earth does any of this have to do with software development? Well, I want you to craft your pull requests with this story arc in mind. What do I mean by that? Oftentimes, we'll skip over the initial exposition because the inciting incident is what triggers the work that needs to be done. It's the feature request or the bug report that gets assigned to you. The rising action, then, is all the work you do along the way to addressing the need, which is the climax. You squashed the bug or you provided the feature, whatever it was. The falling action and denouement are then everything that you do to leave things in a good state. Any refactoring that might be beneficial, making sure you have good test coverage for everything you touched, maybe even setting the stage for future changes, things like that. Don't just tell us you did the thing, tell us the story. What does this look like? Well, it'll be different for every pull request, naturally, but I think this kind of storytelling tends to play out in two main ways. In the first case, you have one or more commits in each of the phases of the story arc. For instance, I get a request to extend the code in some way, but when I dive in, I see that it'll be beneficial to refactor things to make the implementation more generic first. So I create a few refactor commits as part of the rising action. Then, when the code is ready for it, I can actually add the new functionality for the climax. If I'm not using test-driven development, then I really need to make sure I add some commits to ensure that the test suite covers my changes. And then at that point, my pull request should be ready for review. On the other hand, sometimes changes are much smaller, particularly bug fixes. In those cases, you may only have a single commit, but you still need to explain why the small change was necessary. I remember in one case, I think I had a 2-line change to fix a particularly nasty bug, but then it was like a 60-line commit message to go through all the details of how it was dormant in the code for so long and what finally triggered it and how we went about debugging and finally found the offending lines and then how ridiculously simple the solution was once we understood it. 2 lines, 1 commit, but there's still a story to tell. And as you're telling it, always remember the human element. You're not just communicating with the computer, you're communicating with other human beings who have their own frustrations, their own time pressures. It takes a little more effort on your part in the moment, but it makes a world of a difference for all of them. After your PR has been reviewed and approved, it's finally time to merge. Most Git hosting services provide a few different merge strategies, the most common of which are merge, squash, and fast forward. In the squash case, all of your commits will be squashed down into a single commit, which negates everything we've said about using conventional commits and structuring your branch such that it tells a coherent narrative. In the fast forward case, all of your commits will wind up on the default branch, but you don't have the merge commits for chapter markers to better understand the flow of the broader narrative. For these reasons, I much prefer the merge strategy, and it also helps when you're looking at the history visually with a tool like GitKraken, because then you can see the different parts of the story developing alongside each other. That is, you get to see that while Merry and Pippin are working with Treebeard, Aragorn and company are trying to convince Rohan that war is upon them, and then Frodo and Sam are being held hostage by Faramir. Shoot. Now I want to go develop a repo where the history shows the timeline of the Lord of the Rings. Save that for another day. All right, at this point, you might be frustrated by a glaring assumption that undergirds everything I've said thus far. That you always do everything perfectly the first time. You know that's not reality. So what do? Are we sunk? In order to pull all of this off, you need to get really comfortable rewriting history, even public history. Wait a second. How do you rewrite public history without having to go into witness protection afterward? Okay, before anyone revolts, let me clarify that I'm only talking about rewriting the history of feature branches, those being used by you and a handful of collaborators and reviewers for a relatively short time to get some changes into the default branch. If that group is cool with it, then you should be able to safely do all of the following. You can amend the last commit to include more details in the commit message. You can use interactive rebase to split, merge, and reorder the commits so that you're telling a narrative and it makes more sense. Sometimes feature branches live longer than expected because, the work's a lot more involved than you originally thought. As you're doing the work, you want to periodically ask yourself which of these changes are specific to the issue I'm working on and which of them are unrelated, but I just happened to come across them while I was working on the branch. In such cases, you can use things like rebase and cherry pick to subdivide feature branches so you can get changes merged in sooner rather than later. As we start to wind down the talk here, I'm sure there are a number of concerns that have popped into your head over the last few minutes. What if I'm not a Git foo master? That's okay. You can learn. And improving your Git expertise is part of your professional development. If you are the local Git guru, you can help others on your team improve their Git practices. Well, what if I mess up? Don't worry about it. Treat it as a learning opportunity. The Git history isn't sacred. I'm just saying that where you can be better, it's worth your while, but nobody's perfect. Won't this just slow me down? In the near term, as you adjust to a new habit, yes. In the long term, it'll accelerate both you and your team. I guarantee you'll eventually get to the point where all of this comes so naturally you hardly even think about it. Okay, well, how can I remember all of this? Don't. Use a selection of IDE plugins, pre-commit hooks, and CI jobs to automate yourself into a software ninja. For whatever can't be automated, update your contributing guidelines to make checking these things part of your regular PR review process. Okay, but what if the rest of my team doesn't buy in? And after all, the story isn't just being written by me, it's being written by all of us. That's okay. You only have control over yourself, so do all things to the best of your abilities and look forward to the day when others see the value in it. Okay, do you do all of this all the time? No. I'll freely admit that I break all the rules I just laid out for you multiple times a day. My most frequent commit message is just debugging. Does all of this matter if I'm just fixing a typo in the docs? No. Experience brings wisdom, and as you grow, you'll get a feel for when to bend the rules or even ignore them completely. At this point, you may be feeling a bit defeated, thinking all of this sounds like far too much hard work. The most important words a man can say are, I will do better. A journey will have pain and failure. I have found that the most important step a person can take is always the next one. And taking the next step of starting to cultivate these habits is absolutely necessary if you ever want to progress from Hulk smash bug to once there were 4 children whose names were Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy.